Germany was on the verge of motorizing all of Europe, until a political decision buried the most revolutionary project in the automotive industry. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. Berlin, 1932. The streets echoed with the clinking of tram bells, the creak of rusty bicycle chains, and the constant murmur of thousands of pedestrians hurrying beneath a perpetually gray sky. The automobile, that shining symbol of progress that Henry Ford had turned into an everyday object across the Atlantic, was still a rarity in Germany, reserved for industrialists, doctors, and fallen aristocrats. While Detroit celebrated the 10 millionth unit of the Model T and France flirted with its small Citroëns designed for the urban bourgeoisie, Germany faced a question that went beyond the merely technical. How to transform a nation of cyclists and public transportation users into a motorized society without the automobile becoming, once again, another cruel reminder of class differences. The answer seemed impossible. The numbers did not add up. The German economy still suffered the aftermath of the 1929 crash, and the local automotive industry produced exquisite but unaffordable vehicles. Mercedes, Porsche, Maybach. Names that evoked luxury, refined engineering, and astronomical prices. An average worker would need to save their entire salary for 3 years to buy the most economical car available on the market. 3 years without eating, paying rent, or buying clothes. A mathematical fantasy that revealed the magnitude of the chasm between Germany's industrial reality and the mobility aspirations of its population. But in silent workshops, far from marble-floored showrooms with chandeliers, something was brewing. Engineers whose hands smelled of motor oil and whose aprons were stained with graphite worked on an idea that challenged the conventions of the time. They were not aiming to create the fastest, most luxurious, or even the most beautiful car. Their goal was radically different and, to many of their contemporaries, almost offensive in its simplicity. To create the cheapest car possible without sacrificing basic functionality. The technical challenge was monumental. Every component of the conventional automobile of the era had been designed for clients who valued prestige over price. Radiators were works of chromed art. Interiors boasted genuine leather upholstery. Engines had more cylinders than strictly necessary. To achieve a truly popular vehicle, each of these conventions had to be questioned, deconstructed, and rebuilt from scratch. The first sketches emerged in 1930. Workbenches covered in technical plans, material strength calculations, basic aerodynamic studies carried out with wooden models in makeshift wind tunnels. The team was made up of men who had lived through the First World War, who knew the value of efficiency under pressure, who had seen how necessity sharpens ingenuity. They knew the key was not to add, but to subtract, to eliminate the superfluous, to reduce the car to its functional essence. The engine was the first battlefield. Conventional engines of the time had 4, 6, or 8 cylinders. Each additional cylinder meant more power, but also more weight, more complexity, more failure points, and more cost. The engineers experimented with 2- and 3-cylinder configurations, designs that the established industry considered unworthy of a real car. But the numbers were relentless. A small, well-designed engine could move a light vehicle with ridiculously low fuel consumption. And fuel, in a Germany with limited oil resources, was an economically crucial factor. The bodywork posed another fascinating dilemma. Traditional cars used wooden frames on which individual metal panels were mounted, each cut, shaped, and fixed by hand. It was a process inherited from carriage building, labor-intensive and therefore expensive. The team explored revolutionary alternatives. Stamped steel panels produced en masse, monocoque bodies where chassis and body formed a single structural unit, eliminating redundant components. These ideas were so ahead of their time that most established manufacturers would not adopt them until 2 decades later. By 1931, there was a functional prototype. It was not beautiful by the aesthetic standards of the time. Its design was utilitarian, almost austere, but it worked. The vehicle weighed less than 500 kilograms, reached a top speed of 80 kilometers per hour, enough for the German roads of the time, and according to production calculations, could be manufactured for a fraction of the cost of any comparable car on the market. Initial tests were conducted on rural Bavarian roads, away from prying eyes. The engineers drove the prototype on cobblestone routes, dirt roads, steep slopes. They wanted to know if a vehicle so stripped of luxuries could withstand the real demands of everyday use. And the answer was, surprisingly, yes. The small engine roared determinately on climbs. The simple but well-calibrated brakes stopped the vehicle without problems. The basic suspension absorbed bumps without falling apart. But beyond the mechanics, there was a deeper question. Would people want to drive such a car? Manufacturers of the time assumed that even middle-class buyers aspired to miniaturized versions of aristocratic luxury. Here lay the true bet. The hypothesis that a mass market existed, willing to sacrifice comfort and status in exchange for pure, simple mobility. Informal market studies revealed something fascinating. When the prototype was shown to factory workers, office employees, small shopkeepers, the heart of the German working class, the initial reaction was skepticism. It seemed too small, too basic. But when they were informed of the projected price, equivalent to the salary of about 10 months of an average worker, the conversation changed radically. Suddenly, car ownership went from the realm of fantasy to concrete possibility. 10 months of disciplined saving, perhaps with a deferred payment system, and a family could have its own vehicle. The freedom to visit relatives in distant cities, to explore the countryside on Sundays, to not depend on tram schedules. By 1932, the project had advanced to a second generation of prototypes. Details had been refined. Better seals to prevent water from entering the cabin during rain, a simplified but reliable electrical system, ergonomically designed seats despite their economical construction. The vehicle was beginning not only to be technically viable, but genuinely usable. The established automotive industry observed these developments with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Executives of the big brands viewed the project as an interesting but irrelevant exercise. They were convinced that mass motorization was an American peculiarity, a product of high wages and cheap gasoline, conditions that did not exist in Europe. The German market, they argued, would always remain relatively small and segmented, with niches for luxury and commercial vehicles, but no real space for a people's car. This strategic short-sightedness was understandable. Established manufacturers had built their industrial empires on exclusivity and craftsmanship. Recognizing the potential of a massive, affordable vehicle would mean questioning their entire business structure, production methods, and corporate identity. It was more comfortable to dismiss the idea as impractical. However, the political circumstances in Germany were changing rapidly. The country, mired in economic crisis and social upheaval, was desperately seeking narratives of national renewal. Unemployment reached historic levels, the middle class was eroding, and the streets had become scenes of clashes between radical political factions. In this context of collective despair, any project promising progress and prosperity acquired political potential. By 1933, the German political landscape had undergone a radical transformation. A new government, with a totalitarian ideology and grand ambitions, had risen to power. Among its many promises was to motorize Germany, to turn the country into an automotive power rivaling the United States. The concept of the popular car, which had been a technical and commercial project, suddenly became a state priority. This is where the story takes its tragic turn. What had begun as a genuine engineering effort to solve a concrete social problem was co-opted by a political machinery that saw in it an exceptional propaganda opportunity. The cheap car project was nationalized in practice, although private business structures were formally maintained. The original engineers were marginalized or subordinated to new administrators whose credentials were more political than technical. The vehicle's design was altered to serve goals that had little to do with civilian mobility. Unnecessary features were added that increased costs but had symbolic or propagandistic value. Production efficiency, which had been the guiding principle of the original project, was sacrificed in favor of employment schemes that generated headlines but little real productivity. More seriously, the project was integrated into a deeply problematic state credit program. Instead of selling vehicles directly, the government established a system where workers paid advance installments through a forced savings scheme managed by state organizations. Millions of coupons were issued, vast sums of money collected, but the promised cars did not arrive. funds were diverted to other regime priorities, particularly the reactivation of the military industry. By 1936, when mass production should have begun, factories planned for manufacturing the popular car were being converted or designed from the start to produce military vehicles. The civilian project became a facade, a perpetually postponed promise while the country prepared for war. The engineers who had dreamed of democratizing mobility found themselves trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. Their designs were altered without consultation, their technical objections dismissed for political reasons, and their cost estimates ignored in favor of fanciful projections designed for propaganda. The vehicle that had been conceived to cost the equivalent of 10 months' salary would now, with all imposed modifications, cost double or triple. By 1938, the production infrastructure was finally beginning to materialize. A huge factory was built, one of the largest in Europe, with state-of-the-art machinery imported at astronomical costs. But this factory, which should have been producing cars for German families, immediately devoted itself to manufacturing military vehicles. The popular car became a war vehicle. Amphibious versions, reconnaissance versions, versions equipped with machine guns. Civilians who had religiously paid their installments for years, trusting the promise of receiving their car, were systematically defrauded. Some received letters explaining that their vehicle was in production or awaiting allocation, but these were empty euphemisms. The reality was that the civilian project had been completely sacrificed on the altar of military preparation. This transformation was neither accidental nor the result of unforeseen circumstances. It was a deliberate political decision to subordinate a civil mobility project to military and ideological objectives. The regime saw in the popular car a perfect propaganda tool. It could be displayed at international exhibitions as proof of caring for workers' welfare, while simultaneously using the associated infrastructure for completely different ends. During the Second World War, the factory that should have produced popular cars instead produced tens of thousands of military vehicles. Even more darkly, it used slave labor from concentration camps, turning a project that originally sought to improve lives into an accomplice of atrocities. The original engineers, those who had dreamed of democratizing mobility, either fled the country or were silently horrified by what their creation had come to represent. It was not until after the war, with Germany divided and in ruins, that the original concept of the popular car was finally realized, though under completely different circumstances. The British occupation forces found the factory bombed but reparable, and the original technical designs buried under layers of military modifications. With Allied supervision and entirely new management, civilian production finally began in 1946. Ironically, the car that emerged from this tortuous process became one of the most successful and iconic vehicles in history. But it arrived a decade late compared to its original conception, and stained by historical associations it could never fully shake off. The engineers who had designed it with the intent of giving mobility to working families had to live with the knowledge that their creation had been perverted by a criminal regime. The history of this project illustrates an uncomfortable truth about technological development. Technology is never neutral. A brilliant design, an ingenious solution to a real problem, can be hijacked and redirected toward ends its creators never imagined or desired. The engineers of 1932 could not foresee that their economical car would become a propaganda tool, that the factories designed to produce it would serve the war machine, that the savings system established to finance its purchase would turn into a massive fraud scheme. It also reveals the limitations of technological determinism, the idea that technical progress follows an inevitable trajectory independent of social and political factors. The German popular car was technically ready for mass production in 1933. It was not technical obstacles that delayed its market arrival for more than a decade, but conscious political decisions to prioritize other objectives. There is also a dimension of personal tragedy. The engineers who developed this vehicle were, for the most part, apolitical. They cared about compression ratios, fuel efficiency, material strength. They wanted to solve the concrete problem of how to move a person from point A to point B in the most economical way possible. That their technical solution was appropriated and distorted by political forces they neither understood nor supported was, for many of them, a professional and moral tragedy from which they never fully recovered. The question that remains is, what would have happened if the project had remained a private commercial initiative outside the reach of the state machinery? It is impossible to know for sure, but there are indications that the popular car could have been a commercial success without political intervention. The potential market existed, the technology worked, and the projected price was accessible to a significant portion of the population. Germany could have experienced its own version of the mass motorization that transformed the United States, but a decade earlier than it finally happened. This early motorization would have had profound economic and social consequences. It would have stimulated the construction of roads, the development of car-related services, the geographical redistribution of the population as daily commutes became more feasible. It would have generated employment in manufacturing, sales, and maintenance. It would have given millions of families flexibility and freedom of movement that would fundamentally transform their daily lives. But history did not follow that path. Instead of an organic transformation driven by market and technology, Germany experienced a political distortion of a solid technical project, followed by a devastating war, and only then, among the ruins, the belated realization of the original concept. The lesson transcends automotive history. It is a warning about the dangers of subordinating technical and commercial objectives to political agendas. When politics takes control of technology, when projects are judged more for their propaganda value than their real usefulness, when production decisions are made by commissars rather than engineers, the result is almost invariably distortion, delay, and in the worst cases, complicity in greater crimes. The German popular car should have been a story of triumph of engineering and commercial vision. Instead, it became a parable about how political decisions can divert, delay, and corrupt even the most promising technical projects. Germany held in its hands, in 1932, the key to motorize its population and possibly lead a European automotive transformation. But that key was snatched away by hands that used it to open completely different doors, leaving millions of people waiting for a vehicle that would never arrive, at least not when they needed it nor as they had imagined.